Welcome to the next video in our ongoing tutorial series on PsychoPy and Excel. In today's tutorial, we're going to look at how to insert custom Python script into your experiments and how you can use that script to randomize your stimuli automatically rather than having to go into Excel and manually randomize the stimuli yourselves. And before we get started, I should just say that all scripting in PsychoPy is done in the Python programming language. And so I'll be trying to go slow and covering the basics here with you guys today. But if you've never done any programming before and you've never done any Python programming, there might be some things you see in the script today that you don't quite understand. And if that's the case, I advise you guys to go looking around online to find some basic tutorials on getting introduced to Python. And in fact, after watching today's video, if you want to go further and do more complicated things with your coding, you can actually refer to any Python tutorial out there, and pretty much whatever you can do in Python, you can bring into PsychoPy. So there's lots of documentation out there that can help you guys. All right, with that said, let's get to it. So I have loaded up here our first experiment yet again. This is the simple basic memory experiment we made all the way back in the first video. And in some of the later videos, I showed you how you can basically randomize the stimuli in the word stimuli file. So just to remind you, in this experiment, subjects go through a study phase where they study 6 words presented in either green or blue. Afterwards, those 6 studied words are intermixed with 12 new words, and in the test phase they go through and see all 12 words, and for each word they have to make a decision about whether they saw it in the study phase or not. Now in our experiment, we use this word stimulus file. So in the study loop, if you look at our code, what you see is that the stimuli that PsychoPy is going to show are coming from the word stimuli Excel file, which is this file here. And the same is true if you go in and look at the test trials. What you'll see is that we have PsychoPy here reference the word stimulus Excel file, and that's how it knows what items to show. Now if you look at our word stimulus file here, just as review, we have one column which identifies the word item. Then we have some information about whether that item was long or short. I just kind of threw that information in haphazardly just to show you logging extra information that corresponds to your study item. But then we have information about whether that item is old or new, and the first 6 items are old, so these are the first items that will be shown in the study phase. So once again, looking at our loop, we see that we only load the first 6 items when it comes to the study phase. In the test phase, we load all items essentially. And here's the color that items will appear at study. And basically what I showed you before is that if you create this new rand column, which is populated with the rand function in Excel, then this function will update every time you can go to a blank cell and just press backspace or delete, and the rand function will update. And so every time you run a subject, you could conceivably select these columns. You could go into sort. You could sort by the rand column. And what will happen is the words along with their long short tag will randomize, and so each subject will get a different set of 6 words to be the study items and 6 words to be the new items. Now this is okay, but ideally this is the kind of work we want the computer doing. So if we put a little bit more effort into our script here, we can actually tell our PsychoPy experiment how to do this randomization itself. So we don't have to go in and have to remember to do this for every subject. Because the downside to this is if you forget to go in and randomize for a particular subject, then they'll get the exact same study items as another subject, creating a confound in your experiment where you might want these items to be randomized. You don't want any 2 subjects to have the exact same items at study. So we can actually get our PsychoPy experiment to do this all for us. I, by the way, don't claim that this is the absolute best way of doing it, but it's a way that I use that seems to work quite effectively. So in order to do this, we're going to have to insert some custom Python commands and scripts basically into the experiment. Now what I like to do is create a separate routine so I can clearly identify that I've got code in this script, and I'll call this the init code. And I'll insert it right at the beginning of the experiment. And so here, now I can see in my timeline that, oh yes, this script uses some code because it gets initialized right here. And the only object I'm going to insert here, the only component I should say, is this code component. And we'll call this code init. Now the code object allows you to enter in Python script at a variety of convenient times. So you'll see these different sort of tabs here. We can write Python script right in here, and PsychoPy will run it just as it runs its own code. And if you know anything about Python scripting or Python programming, you can do quite a bit with Python. So this is actually a very powerful way to extend PsychoPy. So any code that we write in this first tab here is going to run when the experiment begins, regardless of where this script is in the timeline. So we could have gone back to the end screen and we could have inserted a code object here, and we could have entered code in that first, oh, my code thing has disappeared. Let me just reinsert that. We could have entered code in the begin experiment section on the end screen, and it would still get run at the very beginning of the experiment. So often in this begin experiment section, you want to include variables that you just want to set at the very outset to have some default value. And so we'll actually include a bit of code in here. Then you have the begin routine area, and this is where you can write in some code that will run once when the init code section is reached. If we'd put this script component in the welcome screen section, then any code that we type in here would run as soon as welcome screen started for the first time. So begin routine, wherever you are in the timeline, the code will run when you actually reach that section. Then we have the each frame. So if you want to do some kind of custom animation or updating or something like that, you could have some script that runs every single time a frame updates on the computer. So this code would run like 60 times a second, essentially. So this is the kind of code that you want to insert if you're probably doing some graphical things, or also if you're capturing keyboard input in some custom way. And I'm hoping to have a future video sort of address that. Then you have end routine. So when you leave this section of the experiment, when you leave this section of the timeline, you can have PsychoPy run some code. And then when you end the experiment, you can have PsychoPy run some code. So we're going to focus first on this begin experiment section. And what we're going to do is forget about this word stimuli file, and we're going to look at a simpler file. So instead of having that list of words with the old new status and the color and all that, here I've got just the 12 basic words in a words only file. And I'm going to show you guys how to have PsychoPy read this in and then randomly assign this to a study and a test phase. So first things first, we're going to need to import some Python libraries here. So we're going to use the command import, and the two libraries that we're going to bring in are random and XLRD. Random is a library that's going to allow us to use random functions, which we're going to need to randomize the order of our list, and XLRD stands for XL read. So it's basically the commands that are going to let us read in an Excel file, which we're going to need if we're going to read in this file ourselves. Next, whenever you're dealing with random functions, you should begin by using a function here called random seed. What this will do is set up your random function so that every time you ask for a random number or you ask it to randomly sort things, you'll get a different result each time you run your experiment. If you don't run this, then it's possible that every time you run the experiment, you get the same random order for things. And so we're back to our same problem of every subject getting the same items as study items and the same items as test items. So randomizing the seed here just helps ensure that that's not going to be the case, and that every time we run this experiment, we'll get a new unique random order of things. Next, we need to identify where the stimulus file is that we're going to load. Notice, by the way, that I'm using comments here. So a comment in script is initiated by putting a £sign before any text that you want to write. And it is generally very good practice to get into to comment your script heavily. Even a script that you're writing that you understand, trust me, if you come back in 6 months and you haven't commented things, then you're going to look at your script and you'll be scratching your own head trying to figure out what the heck you were doing. So make sure you're commenting things. It makes your stuff more readable when you're trying to debug and when you look back at code after a long time. And it helps others if you ever share your code so that they can help figure out what you were doing. So I'm going to create a variable called inFile, and it's going to hold on to the name of this words only Excel file. I've created a new folder called stims, and I've put my words only Excel file in there. There's another file here which we'll see a little later in the video. So if I want to indicate where my file is, I type in stims/words only.xl SX. Next, I'm going to indicate the number of study items and the number of test items. There are many ways, by the way, that you could be doing this, so this way is not necessarily the way that it must be done, but this is a way I find that is highly organized. And for instance, later on, if I want to come in and change my experiment and create more study items and more test items, what I can do is easily come to this initialization script, look at the very first tab, and I can change things like what stimulus file the experiment is referring to, how many study items, how many test items. I'm also going to include a variable here called total number of items, and I'll call that num items. And in this case, it's 12. Now, the reason I'm doing this is I could potentially have 24 or 36 or 400 words to load in, and I'm going to make my script load in all those items, and I'm going to allow myself to specify those items here. So if I wanted, I could load in a huge list, and then I could randomize it, and I could pick 6 to be the study items, and I could have 12 in total to be the test items. Okay, so this is all the initialization we're going to do. Now we're going to go into the begin routine area. You could conceivably keep typing the rest of the code I'm going to show you today at the begin experiment section if you want. I like to kind of keep things organized a bit, so here's where I'm kind of defining global things that I'll need for my entire experiment. In the begin routine is where I'll actually put the meat of my code. Because init code is at the beginning of the experiment anyway, it doesn't really make a difference, but for organizational purposes, I'm going to stick to the technique I typically use. So these are definitions. Now on to the code. So the first thing we're going to want to do is access the stimulus file. And the way we do this is by using that xlrd function, and we use a command called open workbook, and the workbook we want to open is our input file. And if we look back over here, our input file was the stimulus file that we want to read here, the file that has our 12 words. So what this is going to do is open this workbook into a variable called inbook, and then what we actually want is to load in this first sheet. This is the only sheet, but we need to do it this way because this is how Excel workbooks work. Once you've loaded in the book, you have to tell it which sheet to read. So in sheet is equal to inbook dot sheet by index 0. So this is basically saying go into the inbook that we just opened, find the first sheet. Because remember, computers start counting at 0. So the 0th sheet is the absolute first sheet. Again, it's the only sheet. But now in the in sheet variable, we will have this stimulus file loaded. Now we can read the stimuli from our sheet. So what we want to do here is tell PsychoPy how to loop through all the different rows here and grab the word for each row. So we're going to use a loop command called for. And let me type this out and then I'll explain it. So for row X in range num items, and this is our loop. What this function is doing here, range, is it's getting numbers from 0 all the way up to num items. So if we look back to num items was 12. This is the total number of stimuli that we've got, which is 12. So we're telling Python to go through the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and each time it goes through that loop, this row X variable is going to take on that number. So the first time through this loop, row X is going to be equal to 0. The second time, it will be equal to 1. The third time, 2. And it will go all the way up, and it will end at 12. So now we need to actually get the row from the sheet for each iteration of this loop. So we first want to get the first row, then the second, then the third, and so on. So the way we do this is we will assign a variable row, and we will make it equal to the in-sheet row values for the row that we're on. So let me explain a few things here. First of all, when we started typing our for loop, we typed it in flush with the left side of the screen. If we want commands to exist within the loop, they have to be indented. So if I instead typed out my command like this, then this command here would not loop. It only loops in Python if you have an indentation. And notice how this is now indicating I can sort of minimize or maximize. When I minimize, everything that's in the loop is getting squished down and hidden. So I know that my command is in the loop if it successfully gets hidden in this way. If I want more code to execute within the loop, I have to indent it just like I did with that first row. So with Python here, you have to be very careful with how you're indenting information, because how you indent information gives Python information about whether it should be included in a loop or an if statement or all sorts of other things. So what is happening with this row variable? It's taking on all the row values for row x. And remember, row x is a number that's going to start at 0, and then it will go to 1, then it will go to 2, then it will go to 3, etc. So what we're really saying when row x is 0 is go into the sheet and get me all the row values in the first row. So Excel will do this, and it will grab all these values. And there's only actually one value. When we're on the next row x, when the for loop repeats and goes to the next cycle, then row x is equal to 1. It's basically equal to the next row. And now this command is telling Excel, go into the sheet and get me the next row of data, and the next row, and so on. So this row variable is not going to actually take on a single value. It's going to be what we would call an array or a list. Because every time you select a row, you could have multiple values. You could have a value in column A, you could have a value in column B, you could have a value in column C. And so row is actually going to be a list of every single value that was found in that row in order. So the very first value in row is going to be whatever is in column A. In this simple example, obviously we only have stuff in column A, so there's only going to be a single item that we can find in our row list. But that's how this function pulls information out of Excel. So the row variable is going to become a list, and we can refer to each item in that list if we want to figure out a value from a certain column. So let's do this, just to show a proof of concept that this is actually working. And let me comment my code here real quickly. So read in the values of all columns on this row. And what I'm going to do is print out the value of column A for this row. And column A is referred to as item 0 in the row variable. So let's just click OK, and let's go ahead and run that and see what happens. By the way, that print command is going to print an output into our debug window, which we'll see in just a moment. So it won't appear on the screen. We can actually see the output right here. So this is our loop working. It looked into the sheet and found valley, friend, land, globe, glass, hammer. Found all the words. So this is great. This lets us know that our code is working. Okay, but we don't just want to print these words to the screen. We actually want to save them. So we need a few more variables here to hold on to the words. So we're going to create some arrays or lists to hold on to our stimuli. We'll actually call this arrays for our stimuli. So I'm going to create an array called word here, which is going to hold on to all the words that we find in our stimulus file. And I'm going to just comment this out. So sometimes it's helpful to leave print commands in your code in case later on things aren't working. You could comment this out and you could just see for yourself, is it even loading the words? Where is there a problem? And so on. I'm going to comment this out because we don't need it at the moment. And so rather than printing out the word that we find, instead I want to save it to the word array. And basically every time we find a word, I want to append that word onto the end of the word array. So what I'm going to do is append row 0. So again, every time we load a row, we're going to find the first item, item 0, and we're going to add it to our word array. And this will basically load in all of our stimuli. By the way, notice up here that PsychoPy is putting an asterisk beside each of these tabs here, but these tabs don't get an asterisk. The asterisk indicates there's some code there. So if you're later on going through a program trying to figure out where did I input code, was at the end of the experiment, each frame, end of the routine, you can go in and you can see where you can easily see where you've got code, so where you even need to look. Okay, so this is saving the word to the word array. So now we should have all of our words in that word array. Now, we were doing all of this work because we wanted PsychoPy to randomize the order of the words for us. So now that PsychoPy has the words, how do we tell it to randomize the order of them? Well, we use a random function called shuffle. and we tell it to shuffle the word array. So this randomizes the order of the word array and ensures that now we have a new random order for each subject. So now that we've randomized our words, now we need to basically fill out the rest of the information. So in our stimulus file, we didn't just have words, we also had information about which items were old or new, which were green or blue, and we need to basically create that same information in our PsychoPy script so that our words will appear in green or blue, so that some words will be considered old and some considered new. Now, we've randomized this column essentially, the same as if we went in and did it this way. So we know that the first 6 items we want to be old, the next 6 we want to be new, we want some to be green, some to be blue. So we need to write a little bit of code to do all of that. So we're going to create some new arrays. We'll call it arrays for our final stimuli. So we'll have word item, the same as we had before. We'll have old new status, the same as we had before. And we'll have word color, the same as we had before. So we're going to create another loop, and this time we're going to loop for the length of the test phase. So we're going to go for the number of test items here, because we know that the first 6 items will be study items, and then the last 6 will be test. So we're going to go in here and create our final stimulus list. So what we can do for our word item variable is we can append word I. So remember what we're doing here. We're looping through the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's what this range is going to do. So the first time this loop goes through, I is going to be equal to 0. So if we grab word 0, we're grabbing the first word in this list. The next time the for loop loops around, I is going to be equal to 1. So if we grab word 1, that's the next item in the list. And then if we grab word 2, that's the next item in the list. So word item is going to constantly be filled in by whatever word we have in the list. Now again, we only had 12 items total, so we could have perhaps just said word item is equal to word and leave it at that. But this technique will work. We could have as many words here as we want. So we could have dinosaur, and we could have, did I spell that right? Dinosaur. We could have car, and you could keep on going, and you could load in a huge list of words, randomize it, and then just grab out the first 12 for the final stimulus list. So this technique will work for much larger lists if you want. And remember, all you have to do is add those extra items, go in here, and then change num items to be whatever you want, and those items will all get loaded in. So remember to comment our code. So we're just going to assign a word item from the word list. Next, we need to decide whether this is an old or new item. And the way we can decide that is by checking to see if we're within the first 6 items in the list or we're past that. Because remember, the first 6 items are going to be old items, and the next 6 will be new items. So determine the old new status of items. And we can determine this by using an if statement. So we're going to say if I is less than 6, then old new is going to be an old item. Otherwise, old new is going to be a new item. So look at how the if statements work. It's very similar to the for statements where you have to indent things. And the indentation determines what PsychoPy considers to be part of that statement. So just like we used if statements in Excel, we're using them here in Python. And we're checking to see if the variable I is less than 6, because if it is, it's one of those 6 items, and we want this to be an old item. Otherwise, we want this to be a new item. Now we said less than 6 because, again, if the computer starts counting at 0, item 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you count that up, that's actually 6 items. So items 0 through 5 are going to be our first 6 items. So if it is equal to 6, then we want that to be assigned a new item. If you're unfamiliar with counting from 0, it's something that you have to get used to if you code in computers, so you might want to look up a few other resources online to see about bringing yourself up to speed, but learning how to think in terms of counting from 0 is important for scripting. Okay, the last thing to determine is the color. Determine the color of the items. And this is pretty easy, considering we just saw how to use an if statement. Remember, from our original stimulus file, the first 3 items were green, the next 3 items were blue, and everything else was just nothing. So if I is less than 3, then word color, not old new, word color dot append green. Else if I is less than 6, then word color dot append blue. Else word color dot append nothing. So in this statement, we're going through and we're first checking to see if I is less than 3. If it is, it's within the first 3 items, so that should be green. If it's not, we're using this function called, or this statement called elif, which basically means if this isn't true, then check another if to see if this is perhaps true. And if that fails, then go on to the final else statement, which is just do this by default if none of the conditions previous were true. So this will assign green to the first 3 items, blue to the next 3 items, and then nothing to the remainder. So now we've successfully loaded in all the stimuli. If we want to double check this, we can actually include another debug statement here. We'll just call this user output for debug purposes. And what we can do is just print out some information so we can see all the different variables that we've assigned. So let's do it this way. We're going to print out item number, and we're going to add item I. So if you want to, so what I'm doing here is I'm going to print out the words item and then the pound sign, and then I'm ending the quotes, and what I'd like to do is add on the I number to appear right afterwards. So I can use the plus symbol to add on some text right at the end, and I'm using this function called str, which takes I, which is a number, and turns it into a string. So I can continue to add other things on. So I can add on the word item, and I'm going to look at the current word item, which is word item I, and then I will add on word color, and then I'm adding spaces in between, you can see, and then I'm going to add the old new status. I've done this slightly out of order, but it doesn't really matter. So what this print statement is doing is just adding some text, and it's adding these little snippets of text to string variables, and so it's going to create one long string that it will then print out. So if I hit run here, welcome to our experiment. Our experiment crashes at the moment, basically because we have to go in and take the single quotes off of our 0 through 6, but we'll be removing all of that anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And here we see item number 0 is hammer, green and old. Item number 1 is pencil, green and old, etc. So here's the list that we have constructed. If I run it again, by the way, we're going to get different items. So instead of hammer and pencil being old, now globe and glass and hammer are old. So things are shifting around. Different items are being assigned to different categories. Great, so now all we have to do is get the new items that we've set up into our study and test loops. So we're going to go into the loop properties here, and now we're no longer loading things from a stimulus file, and we're no longer selecting rows from that file. So now instead we've got all of our stimuli loaded into variables, and we're going to manually assign them each time this loop repeats. So actually now, because we're not even loading a file and there's no rows to select, we actually have to tell the loop how many times to loop. So we could enter 6 here, but I much prefer to enter a variable name like numStudy. Because remember, if we go back and look at our script, our initialization script, at the beginning of the experiment, numStudy is set to be a value of 6. If in here we use numStudy, then later on if we're editing our experiment and we want to create, 8 study items, we can, and now the loop will loop the correct number of times. If instead we manually typed in a 6, we'd have to remember to go in and update this. So using variable names is much more handy than typing in the hard numbers. We're just going to go ahead and erase all our hard work of what we had over here as well. And we're going to change this to numTest. And by the way, I've not been saving this as a different file name, but I'm going to start. I'll probably have to go and recover my original demo one. But this will be demo 4. I'm just going to save it as a new name because now we are using scripts rather than stimulus files. Okay, so our test loop loops 12 times. That's the value of num test. Our study loop loops 6 times, but there's no stimulus file for them to load. So how do we actually update the variables like word item so that the items still actually appear on the screen? Well, you guessed it, it's with a little bit more code. So we're going to create another new routine here, and we'll call this study code. And I'm going to insert it at the beginning of the study loop. Because what we're going to do is at the very beginning of the loop, we're going to assign variables like word item and word color based on items that we've got. And I'm going to do the same thing at the beginning of my test trial. So I'll create a new routine, and I'm going to call that test code. And I'm going to insert that right at the beginning of the test phase. Okay, so let's do study code first. I'm going to insert a code object. We'll just call that code study. So at the moment, the computer has this in memory. I'm just going to delete this long short column, and I'm going to delete this rand column because we don't need it anymore. So right now, this is in computer's memory. It knows there are 12 items. It knows some are old, some are new, and it knows some are green and some are blue. What we need to do is, for the study phase, we need to randomize the order of these 6 study items. So we don't want the first 3 green items to be shown, then the next 3 blue items. So we need to create an intermediate variable here. We'll call this study order, and it's going to be equal to the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5 is going to end it before 6. So this is create a list of the order in which to show study items. And what we're going to do is we're going to shuffle this list. So we're going to use this list to pick out which study item to show next. And we'll just say randomize the order of study list items. So in study order are the values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So if we were to go in and say for study order 0, which is this item, give me the word item that we created, then we would get this word right here. If we then went in and said, okay, for the next study order item, grab the next item, which is the second item, we would grab this item. So if we don't randomize the order of this study order item, then we'll just go through our study items one at a time. But what happens when we randomize the order of our study order variable? Well, now we have an array where these things are all mixed up. So maybe they look something like this. So now we say, okay, let's show our first item. So we look for the first item in study order, and we're told to find item 2 in our stimulus list. So that's 0, 1, 2. So first we show this item. Then we look for the next item, it's item 0, so then we'll show this item, and then it looks for the next item, it's the item right after that, and then it looks for the next item, it's item 3. And so by doing this and referring to this list here, we'll randomly sort through and we'll randomly bop around in the study items. So this is an order list, and it has the numbers 0 through 5, and we've randomized the order of it, and we're going to pull items out of our stimulus list based on the order of these items, based on the order of these numbers. The only other variable we need is some variable that keeps track of what study trial we're actually on. So current study trial. So study trial is 0. Remember, computers start counting at 0. This means we're on the very first trial. So this all happens at the very beginning of the experiment. Okay, so now what happens at the beginning of a routine? Every time this loop starts, we need to go in to our different stimuli, and we need to pick out the correct item based on study order, and we need to assign that so that it gets shown on the screen. The way we do that is pretty simple, actually. So if you remember, we had a word item array, and this held on to a list of all the items that we had. So we're going to pick an item out of this array. The item that we're going to pick is based on a number that we find in study order. So we're going to use study order here, and the number that we're going to look up in study order is a number that corresponds to the current study trial. So we're going to use study trial. So this is the word that we want to have displayed in our study trial as a whole. It is the word item from our stimulus list, which looks like this in the computer's memory, that corresponds to the study order of the current trial. And remember, study order is a mixed up list of numbers 0 through 5. And so if we pick the first item, then we will get some numbers 0 through 5. So one of these numbers will get picked, and that will be the word that we end up selecting. Now, if we look at our study trial over here, we were displaying the variable word item to subjects. So all we're going to do in our code is that word that we're selecting, we're going to assign a variable called word item, and we're going to make it equal to that word that we've picked out. So this is assigning the study item. We also need word color, and we can do it the exact same way. Everything is going to be the same as what we just entered, except that rather than selecting out of word item, we'll select out of word color. All right. So if we went ahead and just clicked run and just see what happens, what should happen is our study phase should suddenly work again, even though we've pulled out reference to the stimulus file. So there we go. We have items that are appearing in different colors. However, we're noticing a bug here. We're always getting the same word in the same color. What's happening here? Well, let's look back at our code real quick. And by the way, here's an output of all of our items. Notice the first item being shown to us was actually the second study item that existed. So the study order randomized, and the first word it wanted to show us was wrench. So we know that our randomization code is working. If we look here, we see that study trial tells us what study trial we're actually on, and that's being used to pick out the items to show, but study trial never gets updated. So we actually need study trial to increase by 1. At the end of setting up and preparing to show the study item, we actually need to increment this counter so that next time we show the next study item and the next study item and so on. Increment the current study item counter. So now if we hit run, what we'll find is that our study phase should work. So pet, then valley, then glass, and you can see that now we're going through all of our different words. So it seemed like a lot of work, a lot of setup, but this kind of coding can actually get pretty quick once you practice it a little bit. If we go on to our test phase, at the moment, nothing is really being presented. It's just one word that's sort of stuck forever. And so let's figure out how to fix that. So using what we just learned, we know that we need a test order, and in this test phase, we actually want to create our test order array so that it has the values that go all the way up to 12, essentially. We're still going to shuffle our test order, and we're still going to have a test trial variable. I'm going to copy the information we have over here at the study phase because it's essentially identical. Then we can go over here, and by the way, we didn't label this. I'm not commenting this code just for brevity, so you don't have to watch me comment it again. But we're going to go ahead and pick test order items here, and we're going to use test trial as an indicator of what trial we're on. And we're going to change this to test and test. And if we hit OK, save this and hit run, please get the researcher, OK. And we have valley, glass, wrench, pencil, friend, street, hammer. So everything looks good. Now one last thing to consider is the data file. So if we open up the data file that we just created, and we look at it and we're excited to see all of our new stimuli assigned very nice and neatly, we open our data file and we look at it and we say, where are our stimuli? We can see that trials were occurring, but wait, what were the words that were being shown? There's one more step you have to include here, which is you actually, because you're manually assigning variables in PsychoPy, you have to also manually log what subjects see in PsychoPy. So you can see, we can see subjects' responses, but we can't see what they were seeing. And that's a bit of a problem in the data file. We don't even know what items were what. So we wouldn't be able to calculate hit or false alarms for anything. Plus I said yes to everything in this example. Okay, so how do you actually log your stuff? This is a very important step. Do not skip this, or your data files will be essentially useless to you. So we need to log study information to data file. And you do so with the command thisexperiment.addData. And addData is a function that takes two variables. The first is the column name that you want to appear in PsychoPy. So let's say word item. And the second is the actual value to save. So how about we store word item? That seems pretty intuitive. Let's do the same for word color. So we can save word color here. Let's also, by the way, save our study trial counter, because why not? So study trial, and we'll save the study trial variable. It's helpful and it's very handy to be logging too much data rather than too little. Because if later on we realize we actually did want to know the value of study trial at each step, it would be far too late to actually figure that out. And so, for instance, here's one more thing we could log. How about this experiment.addData? Let's log the study order. So study order, we're going to log study order, study trial. So this will tell us what number study order was giving us for each trial. Because remember, there are 6 trials. Study order is randomly sorting out these numbers 0 through 5. And so on the first trial, it might give you this number. And the next trial might give you this number. And the next trial might give you this number. So study order is giving you random numbers. So far, that's kind of happening in a black box. This way, we're logging it to our data file so we can see what number study order was giving for each trial in our experiment. We can click. Actually, I'm going to copy all of this. And we're going to go ahead and I will paste this into the test area. Again, I'm not commenting very well over here, but were this actual code that I was going to use, I would just take a couple seconds to comment it. But just for brevity for our purposes, we're not going to. So I'm going to create 2 new columns called test trial and test order, where I will store this information. If I wanted, in fact, let's do this. I could create a new column called test word item and test word color. And so these items will show up in their own column in the data file rather than in the same column as the study items. So actually let me show you this way, and then I'll show you by what would happen if you took this out. So first of all, let's run our experiment here. All right, and now let's look at our data file. So opening up the newest data file. And now what we find is that our information now is getting stored. So we were storing the word item, the word color. We were storing study trial. So this is the first study trial, the second, the third, the fourth, etc. Remember, computers count at 0. Or they start counting at 0. And then we can see this was the 4th item in the list. That would have been the first or the second blue item. The 3rd item in the list, that would have been the first blue item. This should be a green item. This should be a green item. This should be a green item. We can see we're getting the correct items. So a lot of figuring out how to program in your own stimuli is a lot of list management and being able to think in terms of computer indexes and stuff. And by the way, see we have new columns now for the test word item and the test word color. If we had run this experiment and instead of test underscore word item, we just left it as word item, and same with word color, then all these items would actually appear under this column like this, and these columns would not exist. So you get to choose how you want your data file to be logged when you decide on the column names in which you want things. So you can log anything you want. So if there's other information that you want to be logged on every trial that PsychoPy isn't logging, you can write a custom script and use this function, addData, in order to log whatever you'd like. Okay, just a few other remaining things. What happens if you don't want to just load in a stimulus file that's just a list of items, but you have a stimulus file where you have a list of items and they have some attached property or properties. So valley is a long word, friend is a long word, land is a short word. Again, these are kind of like, don't take these labels all that seriously, but imagine I had identified which were nouns, which were verbs, which were long, which were short, etc. And I want to sort of attach this information to the words so that I can log it appropriately in the data file. Well, the way you would do that is if you go back into your experiment and go into the code init section. If you go into the begin routine, rather than just loading in words, we're also going to want to load in long short. Let's just call it length. And if we loaded in all the words into an array, and then all the long and short values, all the lengths into an array, and then we shuffled the word order and we shuffled the length order, then these two columns would shuffle independently of one another, and the association between the property and the word would be lost. So we need these items to shuffle together. The way we do that is with another order array. So first, let me just adjust our loading in function here. So rather than just loading in word, we also want to load in length. And length is the second column. So remember what we're doing here. In our code, we're asking Excel for a row. When we get a row, we're looking at the first value in that row, and we're assigning that to word. But if we get the next value in the row, then we'll actually be grabbing the length. And if we get the next value, let's say there was another property here like noun verb, let's just say. And this is, I don't know, I'm not even going to look at them. I'm just going to categorize them randomly because it's too hard to think and talk at the same time. But let's just say they had other properties like this. Then what I could do is I could have another array called type. And I could add in the next row. And that would grab in these items. So you can load in as many properties as you want. You just have to go further into the row, grabbing the next and the next value. We only got 2, so we're just going to work with 2 because it's a nice simple example. But now, instead of randomizing the actual words, what we're going to do is create a list called word order, and it is going to be equal to the numbers 0 all the way up to the number of items that we've got. Create a word item list. So just like we did with our study order or a test order, we're creating a word order. Or we could even call it a stimulus order because it's not just the word column, it's going to be for all of our stimuli. And now what we do is we shuffle our stimulus order instead. And so now when we want to refer to the first word stimulus, rather than referring directly to word I, which the first time through this loop, we'll always grab valley and then friend and then land. So rather than directly referring to word I, we refer to the word for the first stimulus order. So we're grabbing in the first stimulus order, and that will be a random number, 0 through 12. So it'll be one of these that we're grabbing in. And so if we wanted, we could also have word length, and we can append length stim order I. So now we'll grab the appropriate length. So let's say that stim order, the first time we reference stim order, it tells us to find item 5. Then we're going to go here and we're going to grab word 5, which is globe, and we'll grab length 5, which is short. The next stimulus order is 10. So we're going to go in here and we'll find wrench. And so we'll grab word 10 and then length 10. And so by using an order list rather than by shuffling your actual word list, you can link multiple properties and you can keep them all straight. Oh, and one other little bug, so if you try running the code, you get an error. We need to initiate a word length array that is empty because we're adding items to the word length as we're going through and creating our list. So we need an area to store the word length. One other little touch you might want to add to your code is you might actually want to log the word length. And so you would go in here, and because word length never shows up to a subject, there isn't a single variable name that we can give it to log. So instead we have to log word underscore length from the study order of the study trial. And that will log the word length, and we can do the same thing for the test length if we like. So I'll just go ahead and do that so you can see. So we'll go ahead and we'll add the test word length so we can keep our study and test items separate if we like. It's word length of the test order of the test trial. Oh, and I noticed a little bug here too. This should actually be test trial. So yeah, be very careful when you're copying code that you don't make little mistakes like that. It's hard to notice and it won't crash your experiment, but obviously your data file will come out a little funky. So whenever you are doing stuff like this, it's important to go in and scrutinize your data file a couple of times to really make sure that the correct number of items are being assigned, the correct stuff is being logged, the correct columns are counting in the correct way, and so on. Now, the only other thing to mention is that this code would all run perfectly if this first column didn't exist. So if our data file looked like this, we could load in the first 12 items along with the first 12 lengths, and everything would be just fine. But sometimes you do want to have headers in your stimulus files just for your own reference so you can read them more easily. If you have a row like this that needs to be skipped, you have to build that into your code. So if we want to skip that first row, it's very easy. All we have to do is change the range. So rather than looking at range 0 all the way up to the number of items like this, let's start at the first item instead. So remember, so this is item 0, computer start at 0, this would be 1. So why don't we start at 1 and we'll go up to the number of items plus 1, because if we just went up to the number of items, we'd stop here. Remember, this is how the computer wants to count, from 0 up to number of items. So why don't we start 1 higher and we'll end 1 higher. So all we have to do is set the range to start at item 1 and go up to the number of items plus 1, and this will skip the header altogether. Now if we run our experiment, but we do have one bug, and this is actually an easy one. So we're being told that there is no row 1. And we look at our data file and we say, wait a minute, it looks like there's a row 1, but I forgot one little thing. This is how easy it is to forget things. We never changed our stimulus file. So we were still going by this original file over here, words only, but we want words and lengths. So let's just go ahead and change this. The file is called word and lengths. Click OK. We can click run. Everything should work. And it does. So coding is one of the trickiest things you can do in PsychoPy, but it's one of the most powerful. So get out there, experiment with the code that I've shown you. There's tons of support on the website and other places you can find for other coding tips and tricks. But the more coding you do, the more comfortable you'll get with it. And as you can see, it's a lot of list management, a lot of keeping numbers straight in your head. So just practice, give it a shot, and remember to scrutinize your data files to make sure that everything is turning out exactly as you expect. If you find errors there, you know there's something weird in your code, and you can go in and try and sort it out. So good luck coding, and we'll see you in the next video.